All right. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers tonight for the forum about a very important bill. It's House Bill 129, which was sponsored by Representative Pringle. Hold on. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. All right, I know it works, so there you go. I'm gonna have to do that on a separate computer next time. All right, so House Bill 129 was sponsored by Representative Pringle, and it's a bill that keeps people in the workforce, supporting their families and paying taxes to the state. Um, and instead of making their families dependents of the state when they lose their means of livelihood, and the league is supportive of it because by having a valid ID, you can vote in Alabama, and for many voters, their driver's license is the only ID that they have. And passage of this bill would remove a barrier to voting and additionally reduce the risk of residents losing their job over license suspension. Tonight's forum is co-sponsored by the Alabama Nonviolent Offenders Organization and the League of Women Voters of Alabama. And I want to introduce our two speakers. First, Leah Nelson, who is a research director at Alabama Appleseed. And second is Dana Sweeney, who is a state organizer for Alabama Appleseed. And I will hand it off to them. And do you need to, which I'm going to share my screen so you can make it where you can share your screen. And we'll go ahead and get started, and tell us how you want to handle questions, whether you want it during as people talk, or do you want to wait?
Yeah, terrific. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kathy. Thank you to the League of Women Voters of Alabama and to the Alabama Nonviolent Offenders Organization for hosting us, Mr. Lee Langston as well. We are very grateful to be here to have the opportunity to talk about this bill with y'all. As Kathy said, my name is Dana Sweeney, and I am the organizer at Alabama Appleseed. And just for anyone on the call who isn't familiar with us, Alabama Appleseed is a small nonprofit based in Montgomery, and our job is to change laws. So we work on a range of issues at an intersection where two truths about Alabama collide. One is that Alabama is the 6th poorest state in the country. And the other is that Alabama has some of the harshest laws in terms of punishment of any state in the country. And where those two realities crash together, we find all kinds of problems. So we do lots of original investigative research and reporting to document the harms of these problems. Based on what we find, we make recommendations to lawmakers, and then we organize with people all over the state, team up with advocates to try to change some of these laws. And tonight we are here to specifically speak about the harms of driver's license suspensions, as Kathy mentioned. And our foremost expert on that subject, Leah Nelson, is here to speak on that. So I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself, Leah.
Hi, thank you, Dana. I am Leah Nelson. I'm research director at Alabama Appleseed. I am Appleseed's foremost expert on driver's license suspensions, but I would venture that there are people in this Zoom room right now who know more about driver's license suspensions than I do. So one of them's shaking her head in disbelief right now, but Martha Morgan surely knows as much about this issue as anybody. Laura Yetter as well. So we are in the presence of giants who are really doing incredible on the ground work to represent individuals who are going through the experience of having their license suspended and just being kind of raked over the coals because they the work we're all doing tonight is trying to put those two ladies out of business so that they can, I don't know, open a bakery or whatever they want, and they don't have to represent people who are being destroyed by fines and fees and having their licenses suspended in Alabama. So that's kind of our setting for tonight. Dana, I think you wanted to address the issue of questions as they come up.
Yes. So what I was going to share is, Leah and I don't have a PowerPoint presentation this evening. We were hoping that this could just be a good conversation hour. So Leah is going to talk about some of the background of this issue, talk about HB 129 specifically and what it does. And as Leah shares that information, if you could please drop your questions into the chat as we go so that you don't forget them. And then I will be our sort of moderator for the evening. So when Leah is done sharing that information, I can then recall to the questions and bring some of them up as well. So without further ado.
Yeah, I'll take it away. So driver's licenses in Alabama. I'm going to just start with a really quick primer on why this is such an important issue, who the population is that we're talking about, who's losing their licenses for the kinds of reasons that will be addressed in the legislation that we're supporting tonight. So right now, the state of Alabama suspends driver's licenses for 4 categories of reasons that have nothing to do with dangerous driving. Your license can also be suspended for dangerous driving, but we are not opposed to that. There are certainly people who should not be on the road. But right now, your license can be suspended because you owe traffic debt that you haven't paid. It can be suspended because you missed a hearing about that traffic debt. So like what happens is people get put on a payment plan and then they miss a payment, and then a judge tells them to come to court, and then they may or may not come to court. Sometimes they don't come because they can't get there, or they didn't get the notice. Or in the past, they've shown up in court with $757 in crumpled bills, and they have handed that to the judge, and the judge had said, great, thank you for that money. You owe $1,000, and taken the money and then put them in jail. That would be a big deterrent for me. If I had showed up at jail in good faith, or showed up in court in good faith, only to be jailed because I didn't have all the money, I probably would think twice about going back. And that is really common here. So failure to pay, failure to appear at a hearing about your traffic debt. We're not talking about failure to appear at like a preliminary hearing on manslaughter, just traffic hearings. Alabama is one of 4 states that still suspends driver's licenses for simple possession of drugs. So if you're at home and you have a Xanax that your mom gave you because you were freaked out about finals, but you didn't actually have a prescription for that Xanax, and you are caught with that Xanax, that can be a felony. And if you're convicted of that felony in Alabama, you lose your license for 6 months. The last reason that has nothing to do with dangerous driving that we suspend licenses is for unpaid child support. And that is pursuant to a federal law that actually ties funding for Alabama's Department of Human Resources to those suspensions. So unfortunately, it was going to be very complicated to sever that connection between millions of dollars of federal funding that goes to the Child Protective Services in this state and the option of suspending licenses for unpaid child support. So we are not going to be tackling that reason. HB 129 only tackles the failure to pay, failure to appear, and the drug possession issues. So let's, now you know like what happens, but why does it happen and why does it matter? In 2018, Appleseed worked with organizations across the state, including League of Women Voters and ANVO, to Alabama Nonviolent Offender Organization, which Lee leads now, to survey about 1,000 people across the state of Alabama about their experience with fines and fees. I'm going to do a super quick primer on fines and fees because it's a little bit of a niche issue, but it's really salient to both voting rights and driver's licenses and criminal justice generally. Basically, every time you're convicted of any crime in Alabama, in addition to the potential jail or prison sentence, you also are sentenced to pay money. I mean, in some instances, it's just a fine, right? Like for traffic tickets, you're not usually sentenced to any time behind bars. The sentence is the fine. But for serious felonies, there's like a fine and a prison term. And you are expected to pay all of that money off. That's part of your punishment. But on top of that, you're also charged court costs for having used the court. You're charged fees. You might be charged for the lawyer they appointed you because you were too poor to afford a lawyer. So think about that for a second. Court finds you can't pay for a lawyer. You're found guilty. The court's like, cool, now you owe us $1,000 or more for that guy. You are charged, if you're required to do drug testing, you're charged for drug testing. If you're on probation, you have to pay your probation officer. These fees just add up. And hundreds of thousands of people owe them, and many people cannot afford them. So our survey in 2018 was an attempt to find out, like, what was happening to people who owed this debt over a long period of time that they could not pay off. And overall, our findings were really stunning. For this overall population of people who owed fines and fees for everything ranging from traffic violations up to like pretty serious felonies, we found that 80% of them were giving up a basic necessity like rent or utilities or medicine in order to service their debt to the state. 44% of them were taking out high-cost payday loans, which in Alabama carry a 456 APR. So they're getting themselves seriously into debt in order to pay off or to stay current on their payment plans. About 2/3 of them were borrowing money from friends and family. And then 40% of them were actually committing additional crimes in order to pay off their fines and fees. So they were selling drugs, they were stealing, they were selling their bodies so that they could pay their debt to the state. And the reason they were so urgent about paying that debt is because a lot of them had been to jail for unpaid court debt. 50% of them had actually been jailed because they couldn't pay. And 50% of them said they would die before they paid everything they owe. They were completely hopeless that they would ever get square and get ahead of that debt. As anybody who's affiliated with the League of Women Voters knows, that also prevents a certain class of people from voting in Alabama, unpaid court debt. So this is a really serious problem. Unpaid traffic debt does not bar you from voting, but it has in some ways even more serious consequences. When we looked at the population of people from that 1,000 people that I interviewed and just looked at folks who said that they had lost their license due to unpaid debt and they were still kind of flailing around, we found that they were, in many instances, they were actually worse off than the people who were in that general larger population that included people who committed felonies and misdemeanors. So 90% of them had to choose between paying for a basic need like rent or utilities and paying their traffic debt. 48% of them took out a high interest payday loan. That's a higher percentage than that larger population. Almost 2/3 of them had been jailed in connection with unpaid traffic debt. That might have been because they missed a hearing, or it might have been just a straight up debtor's prison issue. But that is a significantly larger percentage of people than those who were jailed for unpaid debt for felonies. I don't want anybody to be jailed for any unpaid debt, but it's really shocking to think that people who have never committed an offense that anybody would connect with jail in their head are actually finding themselves in jail because they are too poor to stay current on their traffic debt. This group was less likely to have committed a crime in order to service their traffic debt, but still 3 in 10 of them admitted to committing a crime in order to stay current on their debt. And mostly that was because they needed their licenses and they wanted to stay out of jail. The median amount they owed was $869. So bottom line, having your license suspended is catastrophic for people. It is causing them to make desperate choices, but it's also keeping them from going about their lives. I mean, there's virtually no public transportation in Alabama. So people who lose their licenses can't get their kids to school. They can't get themselves to work. There's research from other states showing that about 50% of people who lose their licenses cannot find a job because they lack licenses, and about 40% of people who lose their licenses lose the job they hold. And that tracks what we've seen when we've talked with people in Alabama. I have met people who had a job that had nothing to do with driving, a woman who packed boxes for a moving company in Montgomery, who lost her job when a background check showed that she didn't have a license. And she was like, I walk to work, I pack boxes, I never sit behind the wheel of a car, who cares? But they just didn't want her there. So this is preventing people from holding even the most basic jobs. And then when you look at jobs like, plumbers, HVAC technicians, construction workers, landscapers, maintenance workers, anybody who needs to be in the place that their job happens can't get there if they don't have a license. Martha has a client who's a plumber who lost his job because he didn't have a license. He couldn't get to his gigs, and his company, somewhat understandably, needed somebody who'd get to work. So this is really costing people their livelihoods and impeding their ability to support their families. It's also really, really harmful to the state. Alabama is the 6th poorest state in America. We need people to be working. We need to have a thriving economy. And one of the ways that you have that is by having people who work, who pay taxes, who are able to get their kids to school and support their families. And suspending people's driver's licenses, it's not just hurting the people whose licenses are suspended, it's hurting all of us. I recently talked with an economist at Dartmouth who's done some scoping into how much it costs the state. And he found that according to his research and kind of inferring based on what we know about how many people have their licenses suspended in Alabama, we're losing like $61 million in consumer spending based on driver's license suspensions at our current rate. That is a lot of money. So there are self-interested reasons, even if you don't have your license suspended. If you care about Alabama, if you want the state to prosper, you want to end this retrograde system. And of course, if you care about individuals, you should want to end it as well. So that's kind of where we are at. And why we support this so strongly. I'm going to pivot, unless anybody has an urgent question that must be answered now, to what HB 129 does. Hearing none, I will move to HB 129, which is sponsored by Representative Chris Pringle out of Mobile. He owns a construction firm, which makes him a fantastic sponsor for this because he really gets it, right? He has lost guys who he trained, who he trusted, who he liked, who can't get to work because they lost their driver's licenses. That hurts his business. He knows it's unfair. He knows those are reliable guys, and now he can't employ them. So he has really gone to bat for this. The bill, as I said at the top of our conversation, would end suspensions for failure to appear at a traffic-related hearing, failure to pay traffic debt, and simple possession of drugs. Obviously, this is extremely important because it will help people get back to work and it will stop impeding them from going about their daily lives. And one of the really shocking things that are surprising to me is that we found allies not just in the business community. This is supported by like Mercedes and Sable Steel and other major employers in Alabama, but we also have support from domestic violence advocates who have told us that their clients who are fleeing dangerous situations are impeded from doing so because they don't have licenses, which is a really horrifying collateral consequence I hadn't really thought about till I started chatting with the ladies at the YWCA who are sharing stories of clients who are just stuck in dangerous relationships because they need driver's licenses to get out and live and work just like the rest of us. We have broad support for this bill. The business community generally supports it. We need them to be louder, but they're not opposing it. It's Republican sponsored. Democrats like it as well. Really, our only opposition is coming from the law enforcement community. The Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, called ALEA, would lose a few $1 million a year as a result of this bill. Because if they're not suspending licenses, then they're not getting reinstatement fees, right? Because you don't have your license suspended, you don't have to pay to get it back. And they just collect hundreds of dollars. Like it ranges from about $125 to $425, depending on the offense, if I'm not mistaken. Martha's nodding, so I'm going to say I'm right. So they collect that money every time someone has to have their license reinstated, and they would lose it. That is simply true. So they've come out forcefully against this bill, and that's who we're working against. And unfortunately, one of the members of the House Judiciary Committee, Representative Pettis, is a former state trooper. So this, he feels this really strongly, and he's been very outspoken in his opposition to this bill. There's also been some misinformation spread around the House by law enforcement folks about what the bill would do. So I'm just going to kind of touch really quickly on what it won't do. It will not end sanctions for non-payment. Like the most common question people ask when I start rambling on about this, as I am given to do literally at the drop of a hat, is, okay, well, how are we going to punish people who don't pay? And that's a reasonable question, because there are some people who, if there was no, stick, they would never ever pay. But the thing is, there's a pretty big stick, which is that we can still incarcerate you if we find that your non-payment is willful. If I wasn't paying and I went into court, they would find that I had money and I was just being a jerk, and they could put me in jail. So we can still incarcerate people for willful failure to pay. Failure to appear comes with a warrant. People go to jail. That is complicated. I don't want people to go to jail because they are scared to go to court. But right now, that is what happens, and that will not change if this bill passes. That's something to be addressed in a different way. So incarceration remains a sanction for being a scofflaw, essentially. The bill doesn't cost the state any federal dollars. That was very tricky to accomplish. I am grateful to the people who are not me, who worked with various state agencies to sever any link between federal dollars and the provisions of this bill, because that was pretty complicated, but we are there, so we don't lose any federal funding as a result of this bill. And then most importantly, it doesn't change any penalties for dangerous driving, right? The penalty for speeding is a ticket. The penalty for not paying your ticket is losing your license. This bill changes the penalty for not paying your ticket. It doesn't change the penalty for speeding. It doesn't change the penalty for driving with a busted headlight or even driving with a suspended license. All of those things, you can still be penalized with a fine. People who are too poor to pay their traffic tickets are not more dangerous drivers than people who can pay right away. All they are people who lack wealth, who don't have money in the bank account to pay what they owe. And what we are trying to do with this law is stop punishing those poor people more harshly than people who have the money to pay right away. We're doing well with the bill, but we really need to keep it moving along. There was an initial hearing in the House a couple of weeks ago. Representative Pringle was very passionate, but so was Representative Pettis, and it came at the end of a long day and kind of ended with a stalemate. We have requested a public hearing, mostly because we kind of want to get all of the great evidence in our favor out on the table. So at the public hearing, we're going to have an economist who will talk about why this is a good idea, kind of on a macro level, why it will bring money into the state. We will have an educator who will talk about what she has seen in terms of K-12 children who need support from their parents, not getting that support because parents can't show up. And hopefully we will have an advocate for victims of domestic violence who can talk about what she has seen in terms of women. It is mostly women trapped in dangerous situations by lack of a license. And then someone from Appleseed, maybe me, maybe someone else, will talk about what the bill doesn't do and kind of do some myth busting. We don't know when the public hearing will be. It could be as soon as Wednesday, March 10th, or it could be the following Wednesday. We really need to push to get it on the agenda so that we can get this out of committee and move it along. I think we can win if we can keep it moving. But that's not guaranteed in a year where, I mean, they always want to do all kinds of things that aren't nearly as good as the things I want them to do. And 2021 is no different. I'm going to toss this to Dana to talk about what you guys can do.
Yes, thank you, Leah. As Leah said, I think one of the things that I actually find very exciting about this bill is that it has broad bipartisan support, which is not true for a lot of issues that we work on. You know, like oftentimes there are issues that are a much steeper climb But this is a bill that we have seen lots of people enthusiastic about, and it's something that we can win that would make a huge difference. Now, the folks on this call, I think by virtue of being gathered through the League of Women Voters and ANVO, are very civically minded to begin with. But I did want to just drive home the point that, prior to COVID, Leah and I would spend a lot of time at the State House, and you would really be amazed at some of the comments that we would hear from lawmakers who would say hey, yeah, I got 5 phone calls about this issue from constituents. It's a really hot topic. And it is just true that, state lawmakers often do not hear from constituents nearly as often as our representatives in DC and in Congress. And so even a couple phone calls or a couple letters, emails from us can really boost the profile of an issue for our lawmakers. So I wanted to give y'all access to a couple ways that you can get engaged straight away. So the first is very direct, very quick, very simple. I just dropped in the chat the link to a letter campaign where if you enter your information, you can have letters sent to your state representative and state senator with one click. It's a really quick and easy way to take action. And that is also a link that we would encourage you to share widely because as Leah said, this is one of those issues that we have bipartisan support for, but really need to build momentum for as well. Because as you know, there are a lot of big priorities flying around at the State House. And so we need to make sure that one of them is fixing our driver's license laws, which is not perhaps naturally the thing that would be at the top of the agenda. So we've got to make it so that it gets put at the top of the agenda. The next thing that I was going to recommend as well is I'm going to drop a couple pieces of information in a moment in the chat related to making phone calls to your lawmakers. Feel free to do both. You can send that letter with one click and then also make these phone calls. I will also include some sample scripts so that you can just read straight off the page. But phone calls are another great way to let lawmakers know that you're thinking about this issue. We're trying to build as much public pressure as possible. So anything you can do to share these links around, I'm sure, there are 20 of us on this call. Each of us know 5 people who care about this issue or who would care about this issue if they don't already know about it. And so if each of us were to send that link to 5 people, suddenly there are 100 people who are talking to their lawmakers about this issue. So please spread the word and spread those opportunities to talk to lawmakers about HB 129. At this point, we're about halfway past the hour, and I have seen some questions that did get dropped into the chat. So I wanted to pivot there. I see a question from Catherine Hastings. Any statistics about people who flee the state to get out of the fees? Leah, is that something you could speak to?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, you can't really do that. So there's something, you can, but it won't work. There's something called the Interstate Compact, which basically requires states to honor each other's driver's license suspension regimes. So if you flee the state to escape the fees and you are then driving around like Montana on a license that should be suspended in Alabama, Montana, I want to say every state participates in this interstate compact thing. Montana will suspend your driver's license in accordance with Alabama's request, because there's a national network of these types of requests and warrant information is shared across state lines. So you actually can't functionally state.
Although, could I add a little bit there?
Sure.
I do have at least one person I know who actually has finally had to do that. It's not that they're not still running some risk of being arrested there, but they just were being arrested and saw no way out of it ever in Alabama. So have left the state and workforce. There are people, but you're right. They are still subject to be arrested where they go and can't get licenses there until all
Yeah.
of this is cleared
I mean,
up. So it's no real answer, but some people feel so desperate they have done it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real difference between like policy and practice, which is what Martha is highlighting. So if you live in a neighborhood where the police know your car and they often set up roadblocks, you may well be wise to even leave that neighborhood, but nobody should be forced out of their neighborhood because of predatory policing. So I am positive that there are people who, even just leaving their neighborhood or their town or their county or the state of Alabama might mean that in practice, they're just like able to get something like a fresh start. But in reality, the only way to give them a fresh start is to stop, well, taking their licenses away for the reasons that we're talking about here. We also could reform police practices, and that's something we need to think about and talk about because there are serious disparities in how people experience policing in the state. And, you know, to put a fine point on it, Black people in this state are over-policed. They're more likely to be stopped. And if you're more likely to be stopped, you're more likely to be in violation of any number of minor things that might be wrong with your car, result in a ticket, result in a fine, and result in a license suspension. That is a closely related conversation. It is not a problem that is solved by this bill. That is a problem for all of Alabama to reckon with, and it's something we all need to talk about, and it is not solved by HB 129, but at least some of the worst consequences of that racially disparate policing would be managed and reined in by this bill.
I was going to jump in. I see another question that I can answer from Robin about the timing of the calls and letters. I am of the personal opinion that no amount of constituent contact is too much contact. So feel free to do it more than once. But I would say that the most effective times, I'll say a couple things. So during a sort of like regular legislative week, I think that the best time to reach out is like on Monday, because lawmakers are really only in the State House doing work Tuesday to Thursday, generally speaking. So if you're able to, you know, make that contact on Monday, have it front of mind when they're heading into the State House to do work on Tuesday, I think that's helpful. Another thing that I will say is that lawmakers, even though we're in session right now, we'll take like breaks and recesses even more so now under COVID. And so I expect, I haven't heard for sure what the details are yet about when that next spring break or recess will be.
It's at least 1 week, and I want to say it's the start of April, and it may actually be 2 weeks, which is a bummer for productivity. Although only a bummer for productivity on this particular instance because of the laws they want to pass. It would be better if they were less productive. So
yeah, but so we've got a week or two coming up soon where they will not be meeting, and that is the best time to be contacting them because they literally have no excuse. They have nothing else to be doing. They're not busy at the State House, even though they will be returning soon. So we can certainly share that information, you know, when they do go on recess. That's a great time to, if you're looking to get even more engaged, that's the perfect time to like send them an email or make a phone call and say, you know, like, hey, I would love to meet with you on Zoom and like have coffee. I'm a constituent, me and a couple neighbors want to talk to you about this bill and why we need to get it done and get it passed. So that would be my second thing. So number one, on a normal week, Mondays, on a period where they're in recess or on a break, that's the best time to try to like really get their attention. And then finally, I would add like the day before in the morning of when it's scheduled to come up in a committee. And so as Leah said, we're not 100% sure what the public hearing date is going to be yet. They schedule it week to week. But so that could be next Wednesday, which I believe is March 10th, or perhaps the following Wednesday, which would be March 17th. So assuming that we get it on the calendar for one of those days, a nice, little flood of contact about that bill to lawmakers is very, very helpful. I have a technical question I see here that, Leah, I think you could tackle, from Laura Yetter. Would the bill help people who have already had their driver's licenses suspended for failure to appears or failure to pays?
The bill as written would not, but we do have an amendment up that the sponsor is in favor of that would make it retroactive and waive reinstatement fees. So yeah, it's pretty awesome. I really wish we had thought to bring it up when Representative Pringle was writing his bill. I mean, the fact is, like, the bill was really great, but we failed in that one regard. The amendment is written. We will see if it gets support. So cross your fingers, because that would be a huge deal. Otherwise, we know that as of January 21st, 2021, about 100,000 people had their licenses suspended for reasons that are covered by this bill. That number changes minute to minute, right? Because like someone might pay off their last payment and get their license back. Someone else might lose their license. We know that during COVID, there was a huge drop in payments of fines and fees as people, lost their jobs and were having to pay for all kinds of unanticipated expenses, or just having less money to pay for their regular expenses. So we can assume that a lot of people are in jeopardy right now. So if the bill is not made retroactive, then we will see those people kind of still trapped. Although with a better way out, the reality is a lot of people are not going to get to zero on their debt, so they'll stay trapped forever. So fingers crossed on that amendment, and certainly something to mention if you have contact with your lawmaker that you support the retroactivity amendment that waives reinstatement fees. That, of course, is going to be very vociferously opposed by the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, but it's still something we need to try because it's very important.
And to jump in, I see, thank you, Kathy Jones, for dropping into the chat the membership of the House Judiciary Committee. I should have been more specific to describe that it is currently in the House Judiciary Committee. And so that is our first hurdle. Then we'll deal with the House floor and then the Senate side. And I see a related question from you, Robin, about whether or not it makes sense to contact your representatives, even if they're not on the House Judiciary Committee. And my answer to that is definitely yes. This is a bill that has already had its first reading in the House Judiciary Committee. The public hearing on it is forthcoming. And even though we are having to work really hard to make sure we're pushing the bill and pushing for momentum, we're pretty confident that we have the support we need to get this bill out of committee. I think that we're going to have the votes once it comes to the vote. And so we want representatives, even if they're not on the House Judiciary Committee, to be hearing about this bill ahead of time so that, when it does land on the House floor, it's not some totally new thing to them. They'll be able to think like, oh yeah, like I've heard about this. I've had constituents writing me about this, and just getting it on their radar. That is very, very helpful. I see also, Leah, perhaps you can speak to this. Another good question, Robin, that at the committee meeting, Representative Pringle said he was working an amendment to address fiscal issues, and whether we have a copy of that or what that conflict was about.
I actually am not sure I heard him say that. I am not aware.
I did.
Okay.
I did.
Okay. I am not aware of an amendment that would address fiscal issues. I know what you're talking about. So part of what kind of slowed things down and tangled them at the first reading was that there was a really complicated amendment that addressed some issues that have been flagged by the Department of Human Resources. there is now a clean version of the bill that incorporates that amendment. So that
No,
amendment,
that isn't what I meant. When Pettis got up and opposed the bill because it was going to cost the different law enforcement agencies so much money, Representative Pringle said that he had just gotten an amendment. I had the impression that somebody had handed it to him before the committee meeting. He said, I have an amendment to address that issue. And then when Chairman Hill said that he was going to adjourn and carry over the bill, Representative Pringle said, that will give me time to work the amendment.
yes, ma'am, that's what I'm talking about.
Same amendment?
Yes, ma'am.
Because he said it would address the fiscal issues when
Yes,
Pettis
ma'am. It's-
attacked him.
Yes, there was just cross communication between the two lawmakers. I think that the amendment was longer than Representative Pringle may have expected it to be, and he hadn't had time to fully digest it. He's also not an attorney, and the language of those amendments can be, frankly, daunting even to an attorney, of which I am not one either. So it is the same amendment that you and I are both talking about, but Representative Pringle and Representative Pettis both had not yet digested it, what it meant. But it does address these concerns by various state agencies that somehow federal funding was at risk as a result of this bill. We are highly, highly confident that no federal funding is at risk as a result of the bill that will be advanced next time it's read, because the new version incorporates the amendment you're talking about. There is a separate amendment which would make it retroactive and waive reinstatement fees. That is still completely up in the air, but there's no question about the fiscal issue amendment being fully incorporated into the bill now, because obviously none of us want Alabama state agencies to lose federal funding as a result of an unintentional violation of federal statute. So we are cool on that. It may be that Representative Pettis nonetheless represents that we're not, but I believe we can say with a great deal of confidence that he is maybe not right, as we've checked in with the Department of Transportation, which was the agency that was concerned, and the Department of Human Resources, and neither of them is concerned anymore.
And actually, another question that came up related to the sort of fiscal issues that were a point of conflict. I see Leonette Slay has also observed that per ALEA, the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency's opposition, the real issue is probably just a lack of funding for them and for other state agencies.
We do use fines and fees as a form of tax in Alabama instead of real taxes. That's a problem. So to the extent that ALEA will lose a few $1 million from those reinstatement fees, lawmakers have the power of the purse, and they can appropriate additional funding from different forms of revenue if they are different revenue sources, if they want to replace that funding. You know, what's not okay is saying that because we need to fund state services, that money must come from the people who have it least. And, you know, just as a practical point, even if we thought that was okay, like even if we think people who break laws should pay a lot more of the cost of funding all sorts of state agencies, law enforcement, but also education and any number of other state functions that are funded by fines and fees, the people we're talking about don't have the money. They're never going to pay it because they don't have it. So it's an unsustainable way of funding the state because we're asking people to pay money that they don't have and never will have. And we're basically betting on people continuing to break laws. This is a very cynical way of funding the state as well.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat unless I have missed something. I know, Kathy, you did have something to share about postcards as well being available.
Yes, Lee Langston and the League of Women Voters have are collaborating to provide postcards. If anyone wants to send postcards to their legislators, we can get them to you. And although email and phone are great too, I mean, that's obviously easier. But if you'd like to just do a handwritten note, then we can get those to you. Just just email me or Lee, and we can take care of that.
Terrific. And I do see another question that did get dropped from Sue Carney. Leah, perhaps you can speak to this as well. Does the approximately 61 million lost in consumer spending that has been estimated by the economist from Dartmouth who's looked at this issue outweigh the extra funding needed by Aaliyah?
That depends on how you think about that question. Now, I am not an economist. I took 3 semesters of economics in college, and that is as far as I went. So Aaliyah will lose much, much less than $61 million. Their fiscal note has changed somewhat, but it is significantly less than $10 million that they say they will lose. It's been a little bit confusing on the fiscal note, so I don't want to put a specific number, but it's much less than 61 million. However, you can't compare consumer spending to revenue to a specific agency because like that consumer spending, that goes to stimulate the economy, it creates jobs, it means more money is flowing. So that's all good. It should mean that more tax is collected if more people are employed. So that's good. But then does all of that money like flow back to Aaliyah to fill the fiscal hole? As a non-economist, I am going to guess that the answer is no. The money would not all go back to Aaliyah. It would be distributed in different ways depending on how tax money is distributed in the state. But consumer spending is good for the state while holding people back from having jobs and caring for their families and leaving dangerous situations is bad for the state. It's bad for individuals, but it also means that industries that want to move here don't have the workforce they need. You guys have probably heard about workforce development. The governor wants 500,000 new skilled workers by like 2025. And they focused a lot on education and post-secondary education and job preparedness. But guess what? If you don't have a driver's license, you can't get to that job you're prepared for. The best post-secondary education is not going to get you to that job if you have traffic debt that's keeping you from having a license. So it's not really an apples to apples issue. And that's what's really important to keep. What's good for the state may not be what's good for Aaliyah's year-to-year income. But again, lawmakers have other ways of plugging that hole if they see fit. That's their job.
And I know we're winding down to the last couple minutes of the hour, but I see that Lee, you've raised a question about any feedback or data that we receive about constituent contact. Did you want to share a little bit more about what you were looking for?
Yeah, what I meant to also say is as we do these postcards and emails and phone efforts, could there be a way for us to receive data or feedback on how well this is affecting our state representatives as well?
Gotcha. I would say that we're a little bit limited in like what kind of data we're able to collect on that. So for the like online letter portal that we use, we are able to get some good data in terms of seeing, how many letters have been sent to each lawmaker and get the full spread. So we're able to see, like some, whatever random member of the House has received 5 letters from people who are definitely, their constituent. And we're able to see with that like granular level of detail. Of course, for phone calls, we're not able to do that because we don't have a tool that allows us to track sort of like all of the different phone calls that we're making to our lawmakers. So all of that is to say, it's a little bit of an imprecise process or science. Some lawmakers will respond to constituent contacts. So some are very responsive. Some will just like call you up on your cell phone back if you left a voicemail to talk about the issue. That's a great way to know. But others, frankly, some of our lawmakers are not terribly accessible. Their voice box might be full, or they might not respond to those emails. So it sort of varies lawmaker to lawmaker. But the best we're able to tell is through conversations. So, we talk to lawmakers at the State House about, and, before we have the conversation, we're able to look and be like, oh, this person has gotten 20 emails, 20 letters from constituents on this. We can say, yeah, we've been talking to people in your district. We know it's a real priority for them. How do you feel about this bill? And they'll tell us. But certainly, if you catch your representative or senator on the phone and you have a good conversation about it, let us know. We would love to know what they're saying back to you. But it's a little bit patchwork in that way. So I feel like perhaps maybe can we turn it back over to you, Kathy? I know that we're coming up on the end of the hour. So.
All righty. I'm going to put it back on gallery view. I appreciate your talking to us today about this bill. And this is one of several bills that the League of Women Voters is pushing for advocacy, and we do see it as a priority item for the League of Women Voters. And we're organizing our members to contact their legislators, and we're contacting the legislators on behalf of the League. We've got the president of the League of Women Voters online with us tonight. This is certainly, I think it's going to help us all be able to communicate better. And I appreciate your helping us with getting some facts and figures so that we can write better letters. And so I put this link out on YouTube for the League of Women Voters of Alabama YouTube channel, and we'll share that out. And I guess unless we hear any other questions, is there anyone else that wants to come on and ask their question? This is a good time.
I just wanted to make a statement on behalf of Alabama Nonviolent Offenders. And I know, Leah, you said that the average, fines and fees or reinstatement is about $800. But one of the things that I'm seeing here in North Alabama, in the Madison County area, as far as fines and fees, is averaging about $2,500 for the folks that we are tracking and vetting and trying to assist them with their fines and fees. My last years on the job, as far as reinstatement of driver's license, you were right, it's about $125 to about $400, but I'm seeing a significant increase in $300, $350 is kind of like the average right now. I mean, because my organization has over the last year about 25 people that we have actually did reinstatements for. So you do the math, and that's in this COVID. And my fear is it's only going to get worse. So to me, I'm declaring House Bill 129 must go through this year, because it will help us not only getting people, to become more able to take care of their families, but it will allow us to utilize these thousands of dollars that doesn't make sense for us to pay for people's reinstatement, to use those funds on the fines and fees that they legitimately owe, and finding them housing and finding them ways to get to their jobs as we get them jobs. So I'm declaring that this year, that's the reason why I keep asking these questions. We gotta make this work. Amen.
That's on my
Speak it into existence, Lee.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. That summed it up, and the message coming out of this is everyone that's listening to this needs to speak to their legislators. We've got to get this bill passed. And Lee, we're part of a team. We're working together. We're gonna work with Leah and Dana and everyone else on this phone call. We got to get this passed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up. It's really inspiring to us to see you all here. Thank you.
Good night.